the objective here really is to form a bit of discourse between all of us delegates on the call. And so this slide and my sort of introductory comments are really just to sort of spark interest. The best case scenario is that someone raises a hand and says, Alex, you said this thing at the beginning of the session, and it seems like nonsense to me. Can you clarify? With that in mind, let me start on the left-hand side of the slide. You've all probably seen this shape. And typically, this shape is commenting on the penetration of electric vehicles into the national fleet of cars and vans. And although that is the driver, because of course, emerging demand for EV-related energy is a strict function of the level of EV adoption within all of the cars and vans on our road, this chart is showing you something slightly different. It's showing you the amount of energy that will be demanded from the public charging infrastructure. So this is not commenting on residential charging. This is just talking about the amount of energy that'll be demanded from those fast, rapid, and ultra-rapid chargers within all of our cities and towns in the country. And one of the points to make here is that in 2024, we are just in an inflection point, before which there was only very tepid EV adoption, and much of that EV adoption was probably in homes with private charging. And after this inflection point, we see a much steeper growth year over year in the amount of energy to be demanded and therefore sold to thirsty EV drivers. And I've labeled this, you'll notice, the public sector opportunity. Our conversation today is about electric vehicle charging projects, which are commercial ventures selling energy to thirsty EV drivers. Now, on the right, I've just done a couple of sort of quick points. The first one is, within the public sector and our engagement in EV charging, what's our mission? Well, I would say our mission is to deploy public resources to a commercial venture that's retailing energy to thirsty EV drivers. So in the public sector, we're taking advantage of opportunity. Well, let me just go on, because I'm going to come to this. So our objectives, we have three objectives. The first is to satisfy demand. We want those people who have taken electric vehicles to be able to find the energy that they need, reliably at a price they understand, at charge points that are up and running and reliable. Our objective also is to enhance the value of our real assets. And these are real estate related terms. We want to raise the value of our existing real assets to their highest and best use by engaging them in the retail sale of electricity to EV drivers. And finally, we want our projects to yield such that they attract private investment. And my good friend Matthew is going to talk to you that private investment is out there and eager to identify and capture commercially viable projects. And so I've put the next section here as action. What is our action plan? And these are terms that are going to be familiar to many of you because they are in your authority's electric vehicle strategy and some of your other documents. But what the public sector can do here is project emerging demand. You are by far closest to both the geography in your conurbation, but also where and when electric vehicles are going to be on the road and be looking for energy. Your role is also, as project sponsor, to be forecasting the cash flows that are going to emerge from that commercial engagement of selling electricity. And finally, designing and promoting the investment opportunity. So to attract private investment, our role is to put together a prospectus by which we promote this detailed understanding of where and when demand will emerge, and the promotion of proprietary sites, those sites that are adjacent to both traffic, which is going to deliver demand, and cost-efficient access to the grid, which of course is our supply. Now, a lot of what we're going to talk about today has to do with tendering for private investment. We're probably going to talk about Levi, and we're probably going to talk about non-Levi fully funded projects. The reason I make that statement is that all of these four actions, and particularly the investment prospectus, is what drives the development of those commercial specifications, technical specification, the overall investment prospectus, which gets put into those tenders to attract private investment. Now, we, of course, at Steer do this for local authorities all over the country, even for some of you on the phone. But I wanted to leave my introductory few minutes, and I hope I didn't go beyond the 10 minutes I gave myself, really to identify a few themes that are the basics that I think are important for part of this conversation. Sarah, I think that's really all I have for an introductory segment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, just to come in, it has been noted by a couple of participants that due to company restrictions, we're having issues with people participating in the chat. If everyone could perhaps go over to the Q&A section, I think we'll have a lot more success with that going forward. Obviously, when we come to the group discussion, everyone's welcome to put their cameras on and unmute themselves as well. But thank you, Alex, for kicking us off. Could we go over to Jonathan?
Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully you can see my slides. And thank you for the introduction to kicking off the session, Alex. So as Sarah said, I'm a partner at Ashfords. It's a national law firm that's quite heavily engaged in the rollout of EVCPs up and down the country. And kind of by way of headline stats, we're currently advising, or have recently advised on 11 local authority EV projects, some of which have been subsidised, some are unsubsidised. Those projects have taken place across 7 local authority areas. They should deliver over 3,000 charging points. Some of those are slow, fast, rapid and ultra rapid formats. And overall, they involve over kind of £8 million of grant funding. So before local authorities engage with the private sector market, there are 2 fundamental questions that the council needs to answer internally that really kind of set the tone for the remainder of the procurement. The first question is, what type of procurement process is the local authority going to run? And the second point is, what type of contract is the local authority procuring? In terms of the type of procurement process, for better or for worse, perhaps, the preference amongst local authorities is to engage in a single stage ITT type of procurement. They tend to be quite short and sharp. On the disadvantages side of things, there's very little scope to, there's no scope to negotiate or to hold dialogue. The best you can really hope for is the clarification of the contract that's issued alongside the ITT. Whichever procurement process you go down, you'll need to set out how you'll evaluate the bids in order to determine which bid represents the most economically advantageous tender, or meet, as we call it in the business. In recent times, out of work, services, or concession contracts, what we're really talking about at the moment is the concession model, and this is what Alex was describing in terms of conceptually, the local authority is making an asset available to the private sector. So that asset can be a location, can be lamp columns, so that the private sector can commercially exploit that asset for a set purpose, in this case, installing and operating charging points. I thought it would be helpful if we had a look at some of the sticking points that I commonly see in the procurements that we're working on at the moment. I don't think I'll be able to get through all 5 of these in the 8 minutes or so I have remaining of this slot, but there might be things that seed discussion later on. And there's no right or wrong solutions to any of these issues, but the positions that are adopted can really affect the private sector appetite for the contract being tendered. And I'm sure Matt will have some views on some of these points. Now, the private sector appetite will really impact on the number of charges or the cost of the charge points that a bidder is willing to tender for as part of that contract, and ultimately whether the bidders are minded to tender for the opportunity at all. And we have seen some procurements where only one tender has been received, which kind of can erode confidence in whether you really have achieved the most economically advantageous tender. Additionally, in the knowledge that the procurement process chosen can restrict the extent to which a local authority can amend the contract, if you go to the market with a position that is fundamentally unbankable, that can significantly impact on the timescales of procurement. It can introduce a risk of challenge to the procurement process. And of course, both of those things have a timing and a financial impact on the local authority. So perhaps the first point that has really proved to be a sticking point is the profit and revenue share. Now, it's easy to see why local authorities want some kind of return on a concession contract. And as Alex said, part of this is the opportunity. You're leveraging your assets with hope of some kind of income at the end of it. And if you're putting your assets towards a venture, you might expect some kind of return to come out of it. Additionally, the local authority will have ongoing monitoring costs, and charging points aren't really the core business of a local authority. And so politically, it can be a difficult sell to say, well, council tax has to subsidise the rollout and management of charging points. So what local authorities can do is use some kind of revenue share or profit share as a way of paying those internal costs of the local authority. The return can be one of a number of things: fixed bay fees, a share of revenue or a share of profits. Each of those has a different risk profile for the private sector. Whichever route you go down, the level of that return is often a metric that is bid back by the tenderers during the tender process. And so it's essential that that those bid back numbers are appropriately evaluated in the evaluation methodology, which is published alongside or part of the ITT. And in due course, that will feed into the local authority determinations to which tender offers the most economically advantageous tender. Now, the Levi view of the world is somewhat different. Levi is concerned with accelerating rollout at the lowest cost. And so I think there is a view within Levi that if local authorities are extracting value from the rollout of EVCI, that will erode or detract from maximising coverage at the fastest possible speed. So there is a balancing exercise to be undertaken there. The second point, which often I see as an issue which is clarified by the bidders time and time again is the extent to which a local authority wants control over the tariffs that service users have to pay, or indeed oversight of the service user terms and conditions between the concessionaire and the person who wants to, fill up their thirsty EV, as Alex described. I think on this one, there's an understandable concern that local authorities don't wish their assets to be used to kind of rip off the users. They don't want the tariffs to be so astronomically high that the local authority actually gets a bad reputation for perhaps giving its assets away for free and then letting the private sector squeeze the lowly EV user. And perhaps this is based on an unwillingness to rely on market economics to allow the concessionaire to identify that sweet spot where usage and revenue are maximised, and it will be a sweet spot. This contrasts quite sharply with the bidders who, as Jack will mention later on, I'm sure, doesn't necessarily have foreseeability of energy prices over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And if anyone does, can they let me know? Because I think there's a fortune to be made there if you know exactly what the energy prices are going to be. So that makes it very difficult for tenderers to fix their tariffs. And even if we have a mechanism in the concession contract where there's some other type of control that's not necessarily a fixed price for the whole term of the contract, I think bidders tend to be of the view that they are taking the economic risk and they are actually commercially incentivized to find that sweet spot. And people don't often want to plough money into the capex of installing a charge point, but making it so expensive to use that nobody's ever going to use it. I don't think that's in anyone's commercial best interests. I'm running quite low on my 10 minutes, so I think what I will do is if I just talk about interdependency and interface risk for the time being. Now, to put it bluntly, the private sector is taking the economic risk in terms of its investing the capex. They want to be the masters of their own destiny in terms of making the stuff work and therefore getting revenue and profit from that. Now, some projects, particularly in the lamp column market, depend on the timely upgrading of lamp columns. Often, especially in the London boroughs, that will involve street lighting PFI contracts. And so there's some really careful thought that needs to go into how you deal contractually with the various interfaces between your concessionaire on one side, who's chomping at the bit to install the charge points, your street lighting PFI contractor who is sitting there letting the money roll in under the unitary charge, and then the local authority sitting in the middle wanting to balance these two competing objectives. And so that's one area where careful thought needs to be put into how those mechanisms work. And of course, all this needs to be set out in the contract. Now, I'm conscious I haven't mentioned compensation on termination or the kind of frictional costs and burdens that can often be included in contracts. Maybe that's something that we can pick up on in the roundtable discussion later. I'm sure Matt will have some commentary on how to make these projects really fly through the operational period. But in the interim, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you for listening. And I'll hand over to Jack now, who will talk on the energy pricing piece.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Let me just share my screen. Let me know, just give me a quick thumbs up if that's come through. Brilliant.
See that.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. So Jack Breen from Baringa, sitting in the power and low carbon solutions team, doing strategy and commercial advisory for corporates, energy companies, utilities, but with a specific focus on green transport and green vehicles. So the public charging infrastructure trilemma. So I'm aware of sort of preaching to the choir here, but just to set the scene a little bit before we dive into the energy side of things, we've got it's a balancing act between three main parties. So we have charge point operators, or CPOs, providing infrastructure, charge point management, software, billing, customer service, but are really looking for a return on investment over the lifetime of a concession agreement, and operate a sustainable business for the longevity of these contracts. We then have local authorities aiming to contract with these CPOs in a sort of a way that's balanced between customer value and incentivizing charge point operators. And lastly, we have customers, or the end users, who are the recipients of this service from the CPO, who are wanting a reliable charging experience that's convenient, easy to use, and importantly, it's well priced. Go to the next slide. Brilliant. So on Jonathan's point about predicting the future, we do have projections on these, but it's important to talk about volatility. So at the moment, we see wholesale power being less volatile than it was historically. Of course, there's a bit of a geopolitical shock in the recent past. We see this line sort of stabilizing into the future with a small decrease in the near term. However, wholesale power prices don't tell the whole story. So I've put here the retail energy price stack on the left, and then this is what makes up your retail energy bill. So, what CPOs will be paying for their power at point of delivery to the customer. So, the main takeaway from this, without diving into all the detail on what CFDs are and network costs, is that the wholesale power market, and what is typically used as a benchmark in the contracts I've seen in the past, only represents around 45% of your retail energy bill. Although you might be saying, okay, that's all right. I'd have two major components here, and I can project my energy cost into the future. What's important as well is, and really the main takeaway here is, although there's a plateauing of wholesale power into the future and decreased volatility, there's projectable non-commodity or third-party costs that make up the additional 55% of the bill. The important part is that these two variables of non-commodity or local network costs and wholesale power prices vary dramatically within the day. So I've just taken a random day of the year, and this was 20th of November, so a few weeks ago, pre sort of very windy storm, when power prices changed somewhat. But this sort of represents a typical profile of price of wholesale power in the UK. So we have this double bump curve at the 2 points of high demand within the 24-hour period. And on the left here, these are published and changed by each DNO, but just represents how volatile, how variable these non-commodity costs are within a 24-hour period. And the sort of the operator of the charging infrastructure in this case is exposed to both these metrics. The level of exposure changes. There's lots of different ways to procure energy, and we all are subject to this retail energy price stack, but we might not be aware of it. So the way that you procure power has sort of different degrees of maturity, and we're seeing from charge point operators and the conversations we have with industry is now, where it was historically very sort of risk adverse, clear, sort of fully fixed tariffs you might get for your power, more similar to your home tariff in the past, or might be a day and night, which extends into the multi-rate products. We're seeing the shift to more mature products of energy procurement, so flexible purchasing, demand side response, which I'm happy to answer some questions on it, but it's essentially sort of market-wide half-hourly settlement, so netting out the demand from your charging infrastructure in this case versus the period in which you consume that power. So there is an increase in energy procurement sort of maturity, but then alongside that, and you might sort of see this from the graphs, is that there's an increasing amount of uncertainty in your overall energy bill at the end of the settlement period. So in this case, it'll be a month. So the question might be fair of, why would a CPO want to increase their risk and exposure to some fairly volatile commodities and non-commodity charges throughout a day? Well, there's a balance. So if CPOs are provided more incentive, or are provided with more mature tariff contract structures that Jonathan was mentioning, that align with alternative or additional more mature energy procurement contracts and customer offerings, that they can unlock additional value for the end user. So rather than being constrained with quite an immature or historical view on sort of tariff caps and things like this, allowing CPOs the flexibility to invest in additional energy procurement products where there's more risk that can be translated into customer value, which you can see on the left, then that is sort of the gatekeeper's responsibility, is the local authority. So some customer value elements which would only exist in a more mature energy procurement landscape are time of use tariffs, more credible green power to guarantee that there's not simple sort of renewable energy certificate purchasing for your energy procurement, or managing local grid constraints. This sort of flexible pricing allows charge point operators to engage with DNOs to provide demand side response and reduce their consumption at peak times. And then, of course, additional customer propositions, sort of building out delayed charging and skip features. So it's really food for thought and a bit of an educational piece, but for local authorities. But it is a balancing act between unlocking additional customer value through these sort of additional services of time of use tariffs and credible green power, and incentivizing CPO investment. If it goes too far one way, as Jonathan's point, you might expose local residents to prohibitively high prices. But with market dynamics at play, that balance can be reached, and it is a sweet spot, balancing between pricing and value. But yeah, just food for thought, I think, for everyone. That's it from me. But I think I'm handing over to Matt.
You are indeed. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And morning, everyone. I was going to say afternoon, not early. I'm just going to share my screen. Right, so hopefully you can all see that. So yes, I'm Matt Croucher. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Believe. We're a UK-based charge point operator.
Just to let you know, Matt, sorry, we can't see anything at the moment.
Okay.
Or at least I can't anyway.
Again.
There we go. Something's happening.
There we go.
There we go.
Second time lucky. Right. So yeah, I was just going to little bit of a scene setter, I guess, and then kind of move through some of this discussion. So I guess I want to just begin by underlining, how critical a role we see the local authority market as being, and the reason I was kind of feel the need to kind of spell this out to people, particularly kind of on the investor community, is exactly what the scale of this market is, and it's huge. So something like 37%, a third of all surface car parks in the UK are managed by or owned by local authorities, and basically all of the 8 to 11 million on-street parking spaces, with a few exceptions that are private. So any future EV ecosystem in this country that is going to be successful, the local authorities have clearly got a massive part to play, because they are responsible for such a large proportion of the parking. And yet the challenges that we're familiar with, I think probably everyone on this call, is some of the challenges to date in rolling out, particularly the critical on-street charging infrastructure. So some statistics earlier in the year, published by ZapMap, reported that in Q1 of this year, only 1,500 on-street chargers were rolled out in the entire country, taking the total to 21,000 for the whole country. So that equates to something like one on-street charge point for every 400 or 500 on-street bays. So clearly there's a lot more work to do here, and that's what we're collectively looking to do over the coming years. So what are the challenges then? And so the challenges that we are very aware of, and again, I'm sure everyone on the call, is that it's got some particularly overstretched local authority resources, both at the pre and post award stage of rolling out EV infrastructure. So we do an annual survey of over 100 local authority councillors who are responsible for the EV charging remit for their respective areas, and got responses, and those responses cover over 25% of all of the LAs in the UK. And so our most recent one was done late last year. So there's a bit of a lag in these answers, but the feedback is quite telling. So most still feel drastically under-resourced. There has been a lot of additions in EV officers over the past 6 to 9 months, to be fair. So expect that to have improved in this year's surveys. But 75% of respondents continue to see budget as being a significant barrier, which is an interesting one. And again, be interesting to kind of maybe touch on that in the discussions later, because there is a huge private sector appetite to roll out this infrastructure in addition to the Levi funding. One of the many challenges are the competing pressures that we're very mindful local authorities find themselves under. So EV charging infrastructure is the be all and end all, the focus of the world, our world, or certainly for our company, but recognise that it's some way down the list in terms of all the other pressures on a local authority. We've got our potholes at the top there, you can see on the chart on the right, and housing, traffic issues, even bins. So EV infrastructure way down that list. So it's competing amongst a lot of other demands with limited resource to go around. And I guess the particular challenge that we're cognizant of, and I think we as an industry need to be cognizant of, is that I think Levi is really going to test the capacity throughout the delivery chain, both in the public and private sector, of the ability to deliver at real scale, which we've not really seen before. Levi is a real step change. And I think it's going to test the capacity on the local authority side, everything from the planners to the parking teams and those producing the Section 50 licenses, running the TROs, consultations, legal and procurement teams, and all in all, just a major contract management role for the local authorities going forward for what are multi-million-pound long-run contracts covering very wide areas. So, big scope of work there. And on the CPO perspective, I guess one of the things that is particularly important for a local authority to be considering is their ability to deliver at scale and pace. There are only 2 slides that are vaguely salesy, by the way. Apologies, this is one of them, but I've got to explain who we are. There's a real importance to understand that for these large contracts that are getting awarded over the coming kind of year, 18 months, that these are a large number of charge points that require really significant investment ability. And I'm pleased to say on our side, I believe we've got 2 significant investors in Liberty Global who own Virgin Media O2, and Zoop Capital, who invested Treasury's Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund. And the point I would always kind of highlight for any local authorities looking at CPOs is just to make sure you've got confidence that they've got long-term, steady financial backers, preferably who are familiar with infrastructure investment, because it's a very particular type of investment, long-run thing, sinking assets into the ground, make a few pence in every charge. Got to be able to carry those losses and those upfront costs for a long time and be patient for investors. So, Liberty Global have invested over 11 billion in the past decade, upgrading the Virgin Media network, which you can see on the right there. And that's the magnitude we need to be thinking about for EV going forward. Everything pre-Levi was such a smaller scale than what we're looking to going forwards. And so experienced investors behind the CPOs is very important. And in our case, then being able to kind of point to the build engine that you've got through our partner at Virgin Media O2 to be able to roll out nationally, because again, real step change in rollout, and that's something that just encourage everyone to think about when looking at CPOs to partner with. Can they deliver? Will they deliver? Have they got patient backers? The other key thing is around deploying right solution for the right location. I think there's probably not a single EV presentation at the moment that doesn't have some reference to this effect in it. So apologies, but you've got to state the obvious sometimes. Really important to make sure that they're deploying the right solution for the right location. And there's just a selection of our hardware options there. Skip on through that. Once we've deployed, once these contracts have been awarded and you've kind of got through that stage of it, you've then got the ongoing operation of this. Obviously, take a few years to get the network in the ground, but once it's in there, typical 15-20-year contract. In the longer term, utilization is key, particularly from the perspective of the CPO and the investment that's gone into that, because we're effectively banking on our investment paying off by attracting sufficient utilization of the charge points. And obviously there's a reward to the local authority in that, in terms of the revenue share or whatever the payment mechanism is. But to drive utilisation, we must understand who our consumers are. So we use the Experian Mosaic data set, which some of you will be familiar with, to look at our customers and that. You can actually scan the QR code at the right to see which one you're classified as, should you want to. So a little snippet of information from our customer base. So we've got a very culturally diverse user base. Depressingly, it's mainly males at the moment. I hope that will change. I think that will change over time. It reflects kind of where the market's at the moment, unfortunately. And interestingly, for our customer base, English is often not the native language. So just knowing that is helpful for us to understand how we need to communicate, how we communicate through the app and emails and so on. And then interesting charts at the bottom, I think they're interesting anyway, is looking at who our users are. So the chart below shows where we're over-indexing. So anything above 100 on the chart is where we've got more customers from that group than you'd expect based on just national average. So you can see we've got a lot of relatively high income, well, very high income people at the city prosperity end, your stereotypical, chief exec of Tesla group. But we've actually got a representation across the board, including right at the other end of the scale. And if you then look at where the mileage comes from, I take real heart from this. I think it's a really nice story, is that while there's still this conception that most EV drivers are chief execs of Teslas, actually the mileage is driven by people at the other end of the spectrum. And in our experience, that's often your Uber drivers, your taxi and private hire, your fleet drivers, because they're the one doing the actual mileage. They're pumping in the miles and charging at our charges. So you can see actually where the kilowatts come from is actually quite spread and more so down the lower end of the income scale. Right. So last two slides. One is just to emphasize that really I'm a transport planner by background, as I think some people on the call know, and I think transport planning has got an absolutely critical role to play in everything we are looking to do as an industry in rolling out EV infrastructure, because we need to plan it appropriately and make sure that we achieve that balance between finding where the demand is and catering to that, whilst also achieving equitable coverage and not leaving anyone behind. And you can just see a few snapshots of some of the analysis we do to achieve that. Last slide, and I'm conscious I will have used my 10 minutes. Again, just thought people on the call might find this interesting, talking about utilisation, just to put some colour on that and just give an example of, these are beliefs as of a month or two ago anyway, our best, worst and average site of our 2,000 active charge points today. So you can see on the right hand side is our best utilised site, absolutely amazing utilisation, kind of 3 times what we do, more than 3 times what we'd expect at this stage. High density on street area, lots of dependency on parking, but not a well off area. This is a relatively deprived area, but it's got very high Uber, private hire and fleet drivers, and so looks can be deceiving sometimes when selecting sites, and so it's quite interesting just to see that. On the far left, we've got our poorest utilised site, which is below 1% utilisation. Not great, but again, it doesn't look like the worst site in the world on the face of it. On-street parking demand, but if you do look closely, there are a number of driveways, and it is in a part of the country where EV uptake is lower, whereas on the right-hand side, EV uptake is much higher. In the middle, you've got a site which is kind of still above average utilisation for nationally, but average for us. We've got quite good levels of utilisation, hopefully. And you can see that there's kind of some on-street parking, but lower density. So it kind of sits somewhere between the two. So always helpful, I think, just to see a real-world example of what all of this modelling actually amounts to on the ground.